Hi everyone, happy Thursday. Welcome to this webinar. Hopefully you can see my screen. This is the third in a short series of webinars about the professionalisation of asset management organisations, entitled Are We Nearly There Yet? If you've missed the first two, please take a look at the IAM's knowledge page. Well, you've had them stored, then you can catch up on the first principles that we've gone through. If you've got any questions across this webinar or anything we've covered previously, again, like I said last time, please drop them in the chat bar. We'll be taking 30 minutes to talk over our presentation or webinar with you, and then we'll leave 15 minutes at the end to try and cover off any questions that you've got. So please sit back and enjoy. So similar to the last time, you've got our three happy smiling faces, hopefully you can see, delivering this for you. We've got a range of backgrounds, so should bring some interesting stories. So my name is Jen DeVries. You've probably seen me before. I have PA's asset management capability. I have a background in water and in energy and in defence in the asset management sphere. And within the IAM, I sit on their council and I'm passionate about professionalising asset management.
Hi there, my name is Steve Plum. I work with Jen and Alan in our asset management capability within PA. I focus almost entirely on asset management consulting assignments within PA across the range of infrastructure sectors, but most of my background has been in client organisations in rail and water, so I sort of bring a breadth of view across asset management. And I've also just noticed that you can just tell how much we've aged by looking at our corporate photos and looking at our videos on screen.
We can blame the last year. Hi everyone, I'm Alan Boardman. Perhaps unsurprisingly, I'm also part of PA's asset management capability. Although my background and focus predominantly in the energy sector, I've spent most of my career working in electricity distribution and transmission, looking across the whole breadth and scale of asset management, right down from strategy and objectives through to delivery and operations. I've also done some work across in defence and in transport as well. So hopefully can share a few experiences, probably mostly from the electricity sector today.
So this is the graphic we've been using over the last couple of webinars, and it'll be the one we're focusing around today again. It covers the 5 principles that we believe are, those steps that any organisation needs to follow on their journey to professionalisation. So that first step, empower to be curious, that was all about, how you empower your organisation to have curious people to be asking the right questions about their assets in the first place, to challenge traditional thinking. That second step was about alignment from strategy to spanner. It's about that golden thread. You'll hear it on any asset management training, you'll read it in any asset management, textbook or the anatomy, about that line of sight from top down to bottom, right from the top management down to bottom, what's going on the ground, and all the way back up again. That's what we call alignment from strategy to spanner. And the third step that we covered last time was called all that glitters isn't good asset management. So this is the principle about not getting distracted by the really shiny things. Some of those shiny things we'll discuss a bit further today. The fourth step that we've covered, that we're going to cover today, is about good decision making. It's all about C, R, A, and P. And the fifth step that we'll finally cover today is about the future is real time. We'll look a bit more into what asset management utopia might look like. And hopefully by the end of all of this, we'll be able to answer that question of, are we nearly there yet? So without further ado, I'll move into the actual material.
Cool. So I'm going to kick off, I guess, with the ultimate question: what is value? What do we mean by value? Whenever Steve, Jen, and I do asset management training, we normally start with asking the audience, what does value mean? And if we did a word cloud around this, we'd see the big words coming out like cost, or budget, or value for money, but also many other smaller words as well, because value tends to mean something different to each individual. So if we consider our personal lives, we all use the phrase good value, particularly in our buying choices. So if we're walking around a shop, or perhaps more these days, browsing on Amazon or other online retailers, we'll see things and intuitively think that's good value. However, what's good value to me might not be the same as what's good value to you. So let's take a simple example: buying food from the supermarket. We could argue that beans are beans, and therefore the buying choice is simple, right? We just go for Tesco value beans. Of course, other supermarkets are available, but for other people, there may be a noticeable difference in the quality, and therefore the cheaper value, in inverted commas in this case, option, may not be seen as good value to everyone. And whilst that's a fairly flippant example, it is a good one because these smaller items are often less significant, and therefore what's value to us becomes more focused around cost as a determining factor. But it's important, particularly when we're thinking asset management, is that value is not just about cost. So now if we think about larger purchases that we make in our personal lives, we naturally consider much more detail and bring in other additional factors into the decision-making process. And this could be factual variables, cost or budgets, or examples of specific requirements for the purchase in hand. And we also tend to weave in, particularly in personal lives, emotional elements as well, how we feel and what we think about the purchase that we're making. So if we think about buying a new car, we're not just focused on cost now, we might consider other things like I want a good brand because it's really important to me, or somebody else, I want to go electric because actually I'm more worried about the environment and I'm passionate about the net zero future, or others, I want something cheap and that will get me to work, and so on and so forth. And if you think then of a final example around buying a house, it's really very rare that you find the perfect house that meets all of your requirements. And so we naturally begin to make trade-offs in our decision-making process that actually tend to be more driven by emotion or desire. The house just doesn't feel right, and you can't necessarily explain it because it's all about intuition. So we make decisions in our personal lives based on what we perceive as value intuitively. Although as each of us are different, the decisions that we all make will unlikely be the same. So now if we think about the other side, in the work life, we make decisions very differently. Our perception of value now is driven by what value means to the company we work for. And the challenge now becomes, how do we consistently apply this understanding? So we're driven by potentially the organization's objectives, or customer pressures in the role that we're in, or perhaps historic precedent and culture of the organization. Even government influence comes into it. And more often than not, the decisions that others may have made previously that are actually making our lives more complicated. So the challenge now is that there's usually conflict between these different drivers. A great example from the recent Rio T2 price control determinations in electricity transmission, where Ofgem's focus has been, so the regulator's focus has been all around driving down customer bills, but the wider government is pushing for the net zero agenda, and consumers are probably more concerned with reliability. So value not only means different things to us as people, but it means different things to the organizations and stakeholder groups that we work with. And so even thinking about how those different drivers come together, we still create our own perception of value within that organization, and that informs our decisions. But the more sophisticated organizations that we've worked with will have developed value measurement frameworks that help to drive that consistency in application of that perception of value. And it also provides a basis on which to audit or learn from decisions that have been made. And I'll pass over to Chen now to talk a bit more about how that value measurement might come together.
So as Alan said, calculating value in your personal life can be done largely by gut, but ISO 55000, the IAM, put a bit more structure around this. We define driving value as the optimal balance of cost, performance, and risk to drive consistent decisions in line with our organization's goals. But how do you actually optimally balance these often conflicting drivers? When we're talking to clients, we often draw it as a triangle, each of the corners representing one of these factors, so cost, performance, and risk. And where you put the red dot is effectively how you define value. Do you value cost over performance? Do you value low risk over cost? Do you value performance over low risk? In this example on the slide, it's likely that each person on the call, would put a dot in a different place when asked to, look at value in relation to a car, as Alan said. I, for instance, might see value through a car as simply low costs, capital and operational, and may not be fussed about speed or green credentials or other performance measures. Where Alan, for instance, with a young family and kids and a busy schedule, might be more interested in lower risk, and therefore just have a lower risk car, and maybe willing to pay more for this. And then there's Steve. Steve's a Range Rover man, and we'll just leave it at that. As Alan said, back to the business context, each organisation have a different view on where the dot sits. Although, as I'm sure we can all appreciate, this is a gross oversimplification. You can't justify to shareholders your approach to managing your assets through a triangle and a red dot alone, yet alone any regulators you might have. However, we really advocate actually applying this through insight and modelling. Although this doesn't need to be a snazzy technology solution, as we said last time. As I said in our previous webinar, this can be done with simple maths and spreadsheets. Like, you can even do it with post-it notes on a wall, as long as you take a structured approach that you can evidence. Another complication to this. However, we all know that balancing equations, you kind of need a common denominator. You need a common unit to be able to compare and balance and trade off between cost, performance and risk. Obviously costs in pounds, but performance and risk, it becomes more difficult. The best way to do this, the best way to link back to business fundamentals, to have conversations with shareholders and regulators, is to make this about money. So pounds are the best way, or whatever your currency is, to compare this, including risk, which is often tricky. So risk is really often tricky to put in pounds. The consequences of failure can at first seem really impossible to monetize. For instance, if you're a rail company, how do you put a price on life? But they do. It's sadly, there is a monetary cost to a human life. It's only once you quantify all the elements of cost, performance and risk in pounds that trade-offs can be clearly articulated. So in organisations, we're becoming more sophisticated. Our shareholders and our stakeholders are becoming more educated. Business drivers will change, and therefore value can also change. And what value means to that organisation will also change. So if we bring this back to here and now, many organisations are waking up to their sustainability responsibilities, their environmental, social and governance responsibilities, particularly as a result of the UN Sustainable Development Goals and the commitments of governments, particularly in relation to carbon emissions. This means that there's become another vector in the balancing act, one with greater focus on sustainability. Putting pounds to cost, performance and risk elements of sustainability is hard to do, but it is doable. I won't go into detail here, but happy to chat offline about how this is possible. So that's the approach. Calculating value to make consistent optimal solutions is all about balancing cost, performance and risk using pounds or any other currency. But what difference will this approach make to all of you in the end?
So thank you, Jen. So I'm going to make a bold statement that making cost, risk and performance decisions will change your life. What I probably should say is that making cost, risk and performance decisions will change your organisation. So many years ago, I worked for a water company and led the implementation of what we called at the time risk and value. And we worked for a number of months, as Jen said, to quantify the consequences of failure for all of the water and wastewater service failures that we might experience. And we made our approach of valuing risk and calculating what we called a risk index, which was the cost of the intervention divided by the delta risk. We made that mandatory at a number of gateways, right from asset needs, identifying the original needs, right through to post-construction review. And it's fair to say, it worked really brilliantly and it exceeded our expectations, but not always in some of the ways we expected. So, for example, we'd always thought that our water colleagues were much more risk averse than our wastewater colleagues. So when we looked at our risk index for our wastewater schemes and the ones that got approved and we thought was good value, we had a risk index of between 4 and 8. And what that meant was, we were happy as an organisation to spend between £4 and £8 for every pound of risk that we removed with a solution. When we did the same analysis for water schemes, the schemes we approved had a risk index of between 10 and 15. So we were happy to spend twice as much to remove a pound of risk in water than we were in wastewater, and there was clearly a disconnect there. So we set the benchmark at 4 across water and wastewater. Now that could have caused some problems, but rather than throw their hands up in the air and resign en masse, our engineering teams changed their behaviours. Previously, they've been designing their solutions to the best of their abilities, reducing as much of the risk as possible, and quite often with some quite conservative solutions. And as a result, some of those solutions never got approved because they were always intuitively too expensive. And as a result, the poor operational managers had to live with those risks on their sites or in their networks for many, many years. Now our engineers knew what to design to. So having quantified the risk on site at, say, £100,000, they knew that in order to get a solution approved, they needed to find a solution for about £400,000. And they, embraced innovation. They came up with non-traditional approaches. They focused on which risks can I remove at best value, and they tried, and realised that they couldn't solve everything. And so the concept of residual risk became part of our conversations, and the operational and the asset managers were very clear about what we weren't addressing when we were on site. So on this note, we ran into a bit of a problem in some of our early risk and value workshops because we'd been very diligent in quantifying the consequences of failure. You know, if an operational manager had managed to keep his works or pumping station or whatever it was compliant, you know, normally through the exuberant use of cable ties and duct tape, you know, his baseline risk on the site, you know, wasn't as low as it could have been. And we were simply not valuing the time and the resources that he was expending in order to keep his asset propped up. So we came up with a concept. You know, we've got CapEx, we've got TOTEX, we've got OpEx. We came up with PropEx. So how much money are we spending to keep our asset propped up? And we realised this was a legitimate risk, you know, alongside compliance and safety and all the other things that Jen's spoken about. And we started to include PropEx in every risk assessment. Now, you know, this meant that we had a means to invest to reduce PropEx, and probably, you know, more than anything else that we did, this is what got operational engagement with this process. Because then the former process to this, which was value engineering, which some of you may know, you know, every time an operational manager went to a value engineering meeting, he left with less than he walked in with. So consequently, they stopped coming. Now they had an approach where they could argue for the standby plant, or they could argue for a more reliable version of the plant, and they could do that with evidence based on the probability and the consequence of failure. So they had a means to argue for the solution they wanted, and it wasn't just being subjected on them. The other surprising thing that we found was it changed the nature of the conversation in the organisation. You know, previously conversations about risk were a bit like taking your car to a dodgy garage. You know, it was normally followed by a sharp intake of breath and sort of an exclamation about the impending doom. Now people were actively talking about risk, you know, both in terms of probability of failure and consequence of failure. You know, they were challenging our standard valuations, and they were having conversations about whether a predicted level of residual risk was acceptable to them. You know, and now at the time we did this, you know, we'd not incorporated performance into this methodology. I mean, that's now been done, but you know, it absolutely changed how decisions were made in this organisation, and is still, a number of years on, you know, the primary way that company makes decisions and builds its regulatory business plan. Jen, I think you're next. There we go.
Sorry, having some IT issues. Primarily, my mouse won't work. So moving on to the fifth and final step of our sophistication curve. This is a step into utopia, real-time asset management. I think everyone gets very excited about at the moment, you know, real-time data driving real-time decision making. But first, my job to reflect. The wheels of asset management have traditionally turned slowly. This diagram here is a simplification of the journey I think asset management decision making and maintenance has gone on over the past few years. Back when asset management as a concept was relatively immature, you know, organisations were largely managing assets, looking at assets individually and then fixing them when they broke. Now, we can all appreciate that that's definitely not the most effective way of managing assets. As organisations evolved, and with a large helping hand of regulators in the case of primarily utilities and manufacturers with warranties in some cases, you know, many moved to interval-based decision making. So that's fixing or maintaining something every X years. Usually 5-yearly cycles, you know, in the terms of regulated utilities, drove very cyclical investment patterns and the associated cyclical thinking. Again, really not the best for assets when they've all got different life cycles. You know, some may not need even thinking about for 10 years, let alone maintaining in 5. Beyond this, again, often in line with the regulated periods, many organisations move to condition-based asset management. This is one step more mature. Simply, if something is in bad condition, fix it. What if the widget isn't broken? You know, what if the widget that is broken hasn't actually been used in the last 10 years? You know, is it really the best approach? For a number of more sophisticated organisations are now is about risk and criticality based asset management. So this takes into consideration, you know, the condition of the asset as well, you know, as what condition it's in, as well as, sorry, mix my words, the condition of the asset as to, and including whether it's important or not. So condition and criticality together to combine to make risk. So that's where we are at the moment, and you know, we're talking about the future, and the future of that is real time. You know, wouldn't it be great if we had an agile way of working? If all your cost and performance and risk information was real time, allowing you to make active, responsive decisions, say on an hour-by-hour basis. You know, if asset management decisions being made could definitively use frontline, real, on-the-ground data, or would it? You know, every step in this diagram represents an exponential increase in the data and the system capabilities needed. And, you know, we stressed before on other webinars that, you know, having the building blocks in place, you know, the steps before this on the sophistication curve really can't be stressed enough as you move down these chevrons. But that's largely history I've talked about. So now Steve will explain why real-time data really will benefit organisations, particularly in our current environments.
Yeah, thanks, Jen. So as Jen said, you know, particularly in the regulated utilities, the hamster wheel on asset management went around pretty slowly, you know, normally aligned with regulatory business planning processes. But one thing the last 12 months or so has taught us, and COVID has taught us, is that, you know, the best laid plans, you know, won't survive contact with a crisis. So, you know, just I think Alan mentioned earlier, you know, one of his electricity examples, you know, we do some work with a number of electricity organisations who are now probably 5 or 6 years away from their regulatory business plan, and they're facing this challenge of, you know, because of COVID and because of the way people have changed the way they work, you know, the load they expected hasn't materialised, and they're struggling with, well, what do I do about that, and what's the real situation out there? In water, you know, leakage is a really, you know, one of the primary drivers, one of the primary outcome drivers in water. You know, it's one of the customers very interested in, and it's a really complex area. And, you know, there are a number of interventions that you can employ on water, you know, right from, you know, mains replacement at the expensive long-term end, you know, through things like pressure management at less expensive shorter term, right through to very short-term, you know, find and fix activity out on the network. The problem with the plans in the water companies at the moment is when something changes, you know, if it gets very cold next week, you know, the sort of level of leakage in the network will probably go up by a factor of 10-fold. And the water companies need to be able to respond to that. You know, equally, the big capital scheme of mains relaying down your road, you know, if it delivers early and delivers more, great. If it delivers late and delivers less, you know, how do our plans respond, or how are our plans able to respond to those changes? And at the moment, to a large extent, they can't. So, you know, we need to be able to replan and course correct far more frequently than we currently do. But and we'll talk about some sort of technology around this in a minute. But for those of you who have subjected yourselves to our previous 2 webinars, you know, this can only come about, you know, the technology is only an answer where you've got the rest of the building blocks in place. You know, you've got the curious people, you've got the strategy to spanner alignment, you've got the building blocks around data, you know, you're starting to use cost, risk and performance in your decision making. Only then can you start to turn this hamster wheel faster. And it's not just faster, you know, it's also more complete. You know, we've said, you know, across these assignments that, yeah, asset management has been very capex focused in some organisations and in some industries, but we need to adopt, you know, cost, risk, and performance decision making across the whole of the asset management life cycle, not just the capex bits. And to do this, it means that our data and systems need to cross organisational boundaries. You know, our approach to risk that we employ in operations needs to be the same approach to risk that we employ in the boardroom. You know, it also means our data needs to be, you know, better and more current than it's previously been. You know, 5-year-old condition data is absolutely no help in making the operational repair and replace decision that you might face on a wet Friday evening in any one of our companies. So how do we do this? Yeah, well, to do this, you know, asset management has got to become, you know, not a regulatory 5-yearly process or an annual budgeting process or even a monthly process. It's got to be a weekly, daily, near real-time process, and Alan's going to talk about that in a little bit of detail.
So yeah, I get to talk about rainbows and unicorns, which is always a great title to start the segment. Before I do that, I would just say I see a couple of questions cropping up in the question section. Do put your questions in the chat or into the question section, and we'll get to those at the end of the session. So meanwhile, rainbows and unicorns. This is the part where we can have a bit of fun. This is where we can talk about new and shiny things and get massively distracted from the day-to-day. And you know what we should? On the basis, of course, that you've already listened to our previous webinar on all that glitters isn't good asset management, and you've got those solid building blocks and foundations in place. So the visionaries among us will always have one eye on the future and where it may lead to. But I'd always caution, beware of chasing unicorns. And what I mean by this is that the future is evolving rapidly, and therefore a 5 to 10-year vision can quickly become unachievable or unambitious in the first or even second year. But one constant that remains is that as asset managers, we want to know what is going to happen before it does. We want to know the future with a reasonable degree of accuracy. And we're already seeing some technology come online that brings us a step closer to that. A good example is a project we've worked on in the United States called iPredict. And this is using existing technology, existing data, and some clever machine learning algorithms to predict a fault on the electricity system with a 90% accuracy within 3 days of it occurring. So that can lead the organization to make proactive decisions, respond rapidly, and actually solve a problem before it becomes a problem, which is a great space to move into. So it's a really good example of using real-time information. And actually, that's real-time information that already exists. It's not about installing hardware. But conversely, a lot of the information we use to make our decisions is often out of date by the time we come to make the decision. So the example I would use here would be load-related expenditure in electricity, where you're basing your annual decision-making on the previous summer and winter peak demand data. And by the time you've gathered and processed and manipulated and turned all of that data into useful insight, it could be 12 to 18 months out of date. So how do we start to then become these time lords or these future predictors and dynamic organizations that can fix these problems before it manifests? And technology is naturally a significant part of that solution. Currently, like I say, we're spending vast amounts of time on gathering data, manipulating data, understanding data, and in a number of cases, that data information may not even inform our decision, because it's often easier to go with our gut feel than it is to understand or gather the data in the first place. But we can start to use sensor technology, Internet of Things, and much cheaper devices now that can be installed remotely and bring back real-time information to us, removing the need for that manual activity and presenting us with the near real-time information that we need. But this is only valuable, of course, if we also have the technologies that can process and analyze and structure this data at an equally rapid pace, so it presents us with the useful insights that we need to act upon. Now, you probably recognize some of the words on the slide there: Internet of Things, machine learning, artificial intelligence, and so on. They're all absolutely valid and important advancements that will provide us with that real-time evidence. But it's also important that we have the skills and capabilities to understand the answer. The more complex these systems become, the more real-time they are, the more scarce the resource will be that understands not necessarily what the answer is, but how we got to that answer. And you still need that understanding to make a well-informed decision. So as Steve said, our organizations will need to also evolve to become more dynamic in the way that we use these insights, the way that we plan more dynamically, the way we respond more rapidly, rather than waiting for, in sort of a 5-year set and forget regulatory planning cycle. Becoming sensing organizations that can take in new stimuli, respond to those stimuli, and act much more rapidly. So the combination of all these advancements of the data, of the skills and capabilities of the organizations, it will lead us to become more sophisticated asset management organizations. There's no doubt of that at all. But all of this only really matters if the asset notices the difference. The message at the bottom of the slide there, does the asset know yet, is really important, because we can put in as many shiny tools and technologies as we want. We can have as many whizzy and slick processes as possible. But if those things don't lead us to make different decisions or better informed decisions that have a positive impacts on our assets and lead to positive impacts for our organizations, then it's kind of a waste of effort. So I've just probably undone everything that I just said there, but we should be looking towards these new advancements. We should be looking to become better future predictors so that we can respond more rapidly and we can become the asset management organizations of the future. And I think I'll stop there before I undo anything else that I just said.
So I'm aware we have cantered through the last few webinars, including this one. Half an hour 3 times is not enough to describe how an asset management professionalization really on the ground happens. But what we have covered in summary, as I said before, is about curiosity, is about alignment, is about not getting distracted by shiny things, is about making decisions based on cost, risk, and performance, and eventually, at some stage, when we are mature, start to look and think about real-time information. Professionalization, I'm afraid, is a cliche journey. I hate that phrase. But absolutely, we advocate to walk before you can run. You know, we might sound skeptical of tools and software, which absolutely isn't true at all. But people and process and alignment and governance must all be robust before you can get, you know, excited by those rainbows and unicorns. So I guess the ultimate end to this webinar, Steve, are we nearly there yet?
Yeah, so we started out probably slightly tongue in cheek about, you know, are we nearly there yet? And you know, if we're really honest, you know, we get the privilege of working with lots of organisations. Nobody is there across the piece. Okay, nobody's there. Nobody is brilliant at all of the 5 things we think are essential to be, you know, the ultimate asset manager. But you know, there are some green shoots on that. You know, I read an article, I think it was Wessex Water yesterday, where they're using AI and machine learning to predict blockages in a wastewater network with a 90-odd% accuracy. Now, you know, you wouldn't have been able to do that 5 years ago because, you know, you wouldn't have had the data and you wouldn't have had the computing power. But you know, so there are some brilliant examples. You know, we've seen a digital twin on a nuclear steam system that will tell you what's happening in the system without you having to put a sensor on it. Again, you know, some really green shoots, but nobody is there, but lots of good examples. But you know, as we, you know, our message throughout that is you know, this does have to build iteratively. You know, we see organisations, you know, organisations come to us and talk to us about, you know, we want to do a digital twin, and they haven't got a basic asset register, or they've not got any structure in their data, or they've not got it in one place, or they've not got any people who understand what that means. And so, you know, it can be dull, but you know, don't neglect those first four steps before you want to do that. But you know, I think there are organisations that are on the brink of greatness here. So you know, we're definitely as an industry, we are nearly getting there. So this has been the last of our 3 webinars. I you know, medals, tea and medals for anyone who's managed to survive all 3. We would love to continue the debate. We would love for you to disagree with us and challenge us on some of this. You know, our email addresses are here, and you can you know, feel free to contact and sledge any of us.
Or agree.
Particularly Alan, you know, on anything that we've said or indeed not said. But equally, you know, actually, you know, doing 3 webinars has not been as terrible as you might think. You know, it's been quite fun. It's made us think about a few things. And if you want to, if you've got something interesting to say and want to say it, then contact Graham at the email address below, and you know, and you know, say your piece. And you know, these are very informal things. You know, we don't dress up for them, as you can tell. You know, don't even shave for them, some of us. And you know, please, you know, sort of start, you know, embrace the conversation and get involved with the IM and getting the message out there. So I think that's all we wanted to say, isn't it, Jen, Alan? But yeah, a big thanks to you. We ought to look at questions, didn't we?
Yes. Yeah, I was going to say thanks everyone for joining. As I said at the beginning, the old webinars are up on the knowledge site, and this one will go up shortly, I'm sure. Yeah, I mean, unlike what Steve said, if you actually agree with anything or want to expand on anything we have actually said, then that's also a possibility. We're not all negative like Steve. Yeah, shall we have a crack at answering questions? So can you expand on the way you measure less tangible risks like negative media coverage or staff morale? How are these converted to financial numbers so they can be compared to other risks? Steve? Alan? I mean, I can
have a go. So the negative media coverage is a relatively easy one in a way, because what happens is when you get a complaint or you get something negative in the press, your organisation normally does something to respond to that, and all you're doing is trying to put a value around what you do. So you know, when we did it, you know, what I did it years ago, you know, we knew what we did with a normal complaint, and we could allocate, you know, an appropriate amount of the resources to it. We knew how long it took, and we could put a cost against that, and it was that cost. You know, we knew if we got an MP complaint, we did a bit more, we tried a bit harder, we spent a bit more time, we did a bit more analysis, and that was a different cost. You know, and just where your organisation does something as a result of some of these things, and you know, morale would be another one. You know, if you get a terrible a terrible satisfaction survey, your organisation will spend a huge amount of resources, time, and effort to try and address those things, and put a value around that. But just remember, it doesn't have to be perfect. It has to be in the right sort of magnitude, because you want to be able to stack it up against, the negative media coverage against killing someone, which will probably be linked anyway. But and go, what's the relative value? So what's my relative investment? What am I happy to spend in to address those?
Yeah, I think it's important to build on what Steve said, interrupt him and build on what he said, and just say that, people are also an asset. They are a thing that you track cost against. Like, just because you're an only organisation doesn't mean that hours that your staff spend on something also isn't resource and worthwhile cash, as well as the hard assets in the ground that you own. So yeah, absolutely what Steve said, your use of people as a resource is a cost. So yeah, in both those circumstances, in both morale and negative press, he said, you will spend time on it, and time is cash. So you can put financial values to it.
I'm going to interrupt you now.
I'm going to interrupt now.
The ones that are really difficult are some of the stuff that Jen spoke about, which was around carbon or sustainability. But actually, there's or societal value, or that's a tricky one. But actually, there's some really good resources in the public domain that the government have developed around those that will help you put values on it. They're quite complicated and quite detailed, so you might need to simplify them for your organisation. But they will help you, based on the number of people it affects, for example, put a monetary value on societal value. Sorry, Alan, I interrupted you.
That's right. I was just going to say, Stephen, you're absolutely right. I might just generalise as well a little bit, because you say that there are loads of other examples of those sorts of non-tangible risk or performance factors. And sometimes it's about understanding the impact of them, and if you can understand the impact of them, then you can get towards what the cost of failure is, and therefore you can get to the value that's presented by those particular factors. So you could apply the same methodology to almost any non-tangible item similar to the ones you mentioned. We've got another question. How do you quantify carbon savings that results from your asset management initiative but doesn't translate to a direct benefit? Just did that a little bit, didn't we? Is that it for question? I can't see any more questions in the system there, guys. Can you?
Yeah, that's that one about carbon and roads and congestion is the last one. And I think the person who wrote it probably works for Highways England, but Highways England put a value on congestion because it has a societal value. It's not easy to do, but you absolutely can do it, and so you can start to put reducing delays. We can absolutely put a financial value on and use that as part of the calculations. I think that's it. So unless there's anything else, we'll say goodbye. But please do.
Thank you very much for attending.
Yeah, if anyone's got any questions that they haven't thought of, but springs to mind, always happens to me after the webinar, I said just drop us any one of us an email. We all chat to each other all the time, so I'm sure we'll between us answer your questions.
If you can't remember our emails, they can always get hold of you through the IM, as your famous.
Exactly that. Yeah, absolutely. So I think that's it from us. That is the final of our 3 webinars, and I hope you all have a good rest of your day and week.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye bye.